Okay, hello everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you, Jack, for inviting me to talk tonight and to share my research on a public platform like this one. The timing of this lecture is great, actually, because the research it's based on is about to be published in Industrial Archaeology Review, the journal. Anyway, this lecture is about the Bryn Oer Tramroad, which extended from the head of the Rhymney Valley in the south towards the southern edge of Powys, beyond the Brecon beacons in the north. The tramroad was built in the early 19th century and remained open until the late 19th century. The tramroad was also called a canal tramroad, which was associated with and actually attached to the Brecon and Abergavenny Canal, or the B&A Canal for short, and also the Monmouthshire Canal. So the aims of this lecture are as follows. Firstly, it will outline the history of the canals to which tramroads and railroads such as Bryn Oer were connected, and we'll be dealing with the technical difference between tramroads and railroads a bit later. Secondly, it will outline the historical context of the Bryn Oer Tramroad and the circumstances that led to its construction. Thirdly, it will detail the results of the archaeological watch and brief and walkover survey conducted by us, Mountains Archaeology. Finally, it will discuss the comparative importance of the Bryn Oer Tramroad within the context of 18th and 19th century industrial transport in South Wales. So, like I said, we'll start the lecture by talking about the canals of Southeast Wales, which will provide a historical context to tramroads such as Bryn Oer. Construction of the Monmouthshire Canal was authorised by the Monmouthshire Canal Act 1792, which also established the company of proprietors of the Monmouthshire Canal Navigation, who were basically in charge of financing and managing the canal. The main line of the canal extended from Newport in the south, down here, to Pont Newydd in the north, which is up here. This is potentially a little bit confusing as there are two Pont Newyds in the area, one in northern Cwmbran, which is just down here, and one in Pontypool up here, and it's this one, the latter, that we're concerned with here. This main line was opened in 1796, yet an additional western arm was also incorporated into the canal, known as the Crumlin Arm, which ran from Newport to Crumlin. And as you can see, this here is the western Crumlin Arm. By the time the canal company had decided that the additional arm was required, they'd run out of money, and its construction required a new Act of Parliament to authorise the raising of funds. The Crumlin Arm was opened in 1799. The initial 1792 Act of Parliament that authorised the construction of the canal also stated that tramroads and railroads could be built, leading from the various collieries, ironworks, and other industrial sites towards the canal, so long as they were no more than 8 miles long. This 8-mile limit was also known as the 8-mile clause because it represented an article attached to the Parliamentary Act. So the Brecon and Abergavenny Canal, or B&A Canal, was constructed in accordance with a separate Parliamentary Act known as the Brecon and Abergavenny Canal Act 1793, which also established the company of proprietors of the Brecon and Abergavenny Canal Navigation. This act also stipulated that tramroads and railroads could be constructed, and an 8-mile clause was also applied to these. In terms of its total extent, the B&A Canal extended from Pontymoyle in the south, which is down here, to Brecon in the north, which is all the way up here. The canal was opened in stages. It was opened towards Gilwern in 1794 and towards Talabont on Usk in 1799. By this time, the canal company had again run out of money, and more acts of parliament were required to raise further capital. This was a situation very similar to the Monmouthshire Canal, and overall it seems that both canal companies underestimated the cost and size of their respective canals. Overall, the B&A Canal took much longer to construct than the Monmouthshire Canal. It was finally finished by the first decade of the 19th century. At this time, the B&A Canal represented a separate venture to the Monmouthshire Canal, as indicated by the separate Acts of Parliament and separate canal companies. However, the canal companies agreed to form a junction about 4 kilometres north of Pont Newydd. That's the one in Upper Cwmbran. That's the other Pont Newydd. And with this junction, a continuous transport route was established covering much of southeast Wales. So you just want to see here, that's the Monmouthshire Canal, or the northern end of it, and that's the junction there. And it's basically a continuous route going across southeast Wales. Together, the two canals represented a serious industrial feat, as they covered nearly 124 kilometres and had about 180 locks. That's really quite staggering when you consider that all of this was constructed using just hand tools and human labour in the form of navvies. By today, the canals, or at least what's left of them, are known together as the Monmouthshire and Brecon Canal. Much of the line has been restored today after its abandonment in the mid-20th century. So here are some key views along the canal. These mainly cover the B&A Canal, as much of the Monmouthshire Canal, particularly the Crumlin arm, has by today been infilled or just been completely demolished. Today, views along the Crumlin arm would mostly comprise like A roads and modern housing and things like that. At the northern terminus of the B&A Canal is the Brecon Canal Basin, which is here, constructed around 1812, which could basically be seen as a commemoration of the opening of the canal as a whole, as it marked the northern terminus and the last stretch of canal to be built. To the southeast of here is Talbot and Usk, where a bank of lime kilns here was built in the early 19th century. These kilns were actually situated beneath the Bryn Oer Tramroad, which ran along here. This will be detailed later. Lime produced here was collected in barrels, which were discharged directly into the canal wharfs, ready for haulage. Gilwern Wharf up here also represented a significant haulage site. Coal, limestone, and iron were sent here via tramroad and railroad from quite significant distances, particularly from the heads of the valleys area to the west. So basically along here, this stretch here. Finally, here's 14 locks down here near Newport city centre, where a steep flight of continuous canal locks was constructed towards the start of the Crumlin arm of the Monmouthshire Canal. This, again, was a serious achievement in canal engineering for the time. These can be visited and seen today at the 14 Locks Canal Centre. So, now that I've provided a brief summary of the Monmouthshire and B&A canals, we can focus on the tram roads and railroads that were built in association with the canals. These were really important as the canals, in fact, as without these railed lines, very few industrial sites would have been able to reach or utilize the canals, and therefore the ports in the south. It must be remembered that canals by themselves were relatively ineffective in haulage operations, as they were linear and undeviating routes rather than expansive networks. It was only with railed transport that canals could expand into such networks. But in order to comprehend the rail transport systems attached to the canals, it's first necessary to understand the different types that existed. So first, there were tram roads. These were formed of L-profile tram plates, and therefore known as plateways. And here's a L-profile tram plate here. The vertical flange on the rail means that no flange was necessary on the tram wheel, and the flange basically acted as a barrier to the wheel, stopping it from veering sideways off the tracks, as you can see here. That's the flange, the vertical flange, and the wheel kind of rested against it. On the left is a painting by Brian Collins. This image is conjectural and was painted in the 20th century. I've chosen it here because it illustrates quite nicely the form of the typical 18th and 19th century tram road. So here we can see a series of L-profile tram plates with vertical flanges, on top of which are tram wheels with no flanges. In other words, are just plain wheels, as you can see here, almost like cartwheels, I guess. Plate rails were first used in 1787 when the Sheffield colliery manager John Kerr designed them for use in his coal mines. So by the time the Monmouthshire and B&A canals were opened, plateways, or tram roads, if you like, were a relatively new invention. Their first appearance in Wales may have been and I stress may because there's still some debate around this, at the comparative ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil in 1788, only a year after their invention, which were cast for James Cocksher, the so-called dram plates with a D. And I suppose no lecture on Welsh industrial archaeology would be complete without a Michael Blackmore illustration. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. It's become almost iconic. So here's a Blackmore illustration, which nicely depicts the relationship between Canal and Tramroad. Here's the canal going along here, and here's the tramroad going over the bridge. In this case, the canal is the B&A Canal, and the tramroad is Bailey's Tramroad, which terminated at Govelon near Abergavenny and not too far away from Gilwern Wharf. So tramroads could be contrasted with railroads. These were formed of rails with no flanges. Unlike with tramroads, the point of contact with the tram wheel was narrow rather than flat, and the rail was basically set on edge. Because of this, railroads were also known as edgeways. Also, on railroads, the tram's wheels needed to be flanged so they could stay on the track. And here's a diagram on the right. You've got the wheel and you've got a flange going down one side of it, which keeps it on the unflanged rail. In terms of chronology, edge rails were a far earlier invention than plate rails, and until John Kerr's invention of the plate form in 1787, they represented the standard form of rail in Britain. Timber edge rails, for example, were being used in Britain on wagonways in the 16th century. By 1789, the engineer William Jessup had invented a new form of edge rail, the fish belly rail, which featured prominently on 18th and 19th century railroads, as well as early railways, which we'll touch on in the next slide. As you can see with the image on the left here, the middle of the rail is descended like the belly of a fish. And with this form, the rail could be raised above the ground, which prevented the accumulation of dirt on the rails. Dirt accumulation represented a significant issue for earlier edge rails. Also, this fish belly form made the rail stronger and less likely to break under the weight of the tram. In a fairly cost-effective manner as well, as iron was saved by keeping the longitudinal edges, these thin, as if they were standard edge rails. It was only thick towards the middle. Railway is basically a term for an edged railroad on which steam locomotives traveled. These were invented towards the end of the Great Canal construction projects of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By the mid to late 19th century, railways played a major role in the downfall of the canal networks, as steam locomotives have become a far more cost and time effective means of hauling freight. In some instances, railways directly replaced canals and were constructed over their infilled remains. The first steam locomotive was probably built by, or possibly by, Richard Trevithick in 1802, which is remarkably early, at Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, although this was more of an experimental prototype than a fully functioning locomotive. In 1804, Trevithick had built a locomotive in South Wales that could haul freight. The locomotive hauled 10 tons of iron from the Penydarren Ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil to Aberconnon. This journey was commemorated in the painting on the right. By 1808, Trevithick had built Catch Me Who Can, which was the first steam-powered locomotive to carry fare-paying passengers. So as we can see, the invention of steam locomotives came about really early, at a time when the canal networks had, in some cases, only been open for about a decade. And because of this, the earliest locomotives in Wales made use of existing plate rail infrastructure, which happened to be more prevalent at the time in Wales than edge rail infrastructure. For example, in the painting on the right again, Trevithick's 1804 locomotive was traveling on plate rails, as you just about see here, the L profile plates, kind of scallops here for strength. By 1829, around the same time that the famous Stephenson's rocket was being exhibited in the north of England, steam locomotives began to be introduced to the Monmouthshire and B&A Canal system, when a locomotive known as Britannia was introduced to the Sir Tramroad. As you might expect, the plate rails of the tramroad broke frequently under the weight of the locomotive, and it was ultimately realized that plate rails were unsuitable for locomotive transport. As we can see with the image on the left, which depicts the Stockton and Darlington Railway in northeast England of 1825, which was the first fully functioning public railway in Britain. Locomotives here had flanged wheels and travelled on edge rails. Just about see that. This became the standard form of the railway. Even the gauge that it incorporated, which was 4 foot 8.5 inches wide, became the standard gauge for future railways. This gauge was also known as the Stephenson gauge, as it was first used at Killingworth Colliery by George Stephenson, the inventor of the rocket. So here is a map of some of the more major tram roads and railroads of the Monmouthshire and B&A Canal network. This is by no means all of them. In total, there were roughly 34, but trying to display all of these in a single map was just impossible. It would look like a complete mess. Some of the most historically important lines are the Sir Tram roads built in 1806. That should read it. That's a typo there. That should read 1806, not 180. This ran between the Tredegar Ironworks and 9 Mile Point. This line later became the Sir Howie Railway. The Rumney Tramroad was also a significant undertaking, which was built in 1826 between the Rumney or Union Ironworks and Bassaleg in the south. Some of the earliest lines were the Killeen Tramroad and the Rasa and Clydach Railroads of 1794. And for future reference, here is the Bryn Oer Tramroad going down here. It could just about be seen in this map that by the 1820s, rail transport routes had been established along the major valleys of South Wales. It can also be seen that some of the later lines were enormous, like the Rumney and Sir Howie tramroads. These obviously far exceeded the 8-mile clause set by Parliament, although a common trick performed by some haulage firms was to construct a short tramroad leading to the canal, which would officially become the Canal Tramroad, and to connect it to an enormous one. This second enormous tramroad was not officially a canal tramroad, as it wasn't technically connected to the canals, and therefore didn't break the 8-mile clause. Other rail lines, such as the Hay Tramroad, which is 24 miles long, required their own acts of parliament that were separate to those authorising the construction of the canals. Unfortunately, this one has been omitted from the map due to a lack of space, but extended all the way up to Herefordshire, across what is now the English-Welsh border. In accordance with the 1792 Canal Act, the Hay Tramroad connected with the Watton Tramroad in Brecon, which was tiny, about 700 metres long, and its course can be traced today on the street known as the Watton, which is just north of the canal. So overall, despite the omissions, I hope this map gives a rough idea of just how expansive the Monmouthshire and B&A Canal network was by virtue of its tramroads and railroads. The work of Benjamin Outram was a significant influence on the form and design of the railed infrastructure of the canals. Outram served as engineering advisor to the canal companies, and he was a proponent of plateways or tramroads as opposed to edgeways or railroads. So in 1799, he recommended that all rail infrastructure, which at this time comprised railroads, be converted to tramroads. These older railroads included, for example, the Rasa and Clydach railroads. Also, from this point, all rail lines added to the canal network were of the tramroad variety. And this is why the majority of the rail lines across southeast Wales are tramroads rather than railroads. Outram thought that edge rails were structurally weak and that plate rails were less prone to breakage as they were fitted in individual sections. Just how true this is up for debate, as plate rails also broke frequently, as the flanges were susceptible to snap off, as you can imagine. The first plate rail constructed by Outram ran between the quarries at Critch in Derbyshire to the Bulbridge Wharf on the Cromford Canal. This tramroad was constructed in 1793 in partnership with William Jesser, the same guy who invented the fish belly rail. For the purpose of laying plates and fixing them in place, Outram devised a series of innovations or standards by which tramroads could be constructed. For example, Outram advocated the use of stone sleepers. These sleepers were basically rough stone blocks onto which plates were mounted with a 3-foot-long rail spike, also known as an Outram standard rail spike. The image in the middle is of a stone sleeper we found at the Clydach Ironworks near Abergavenny. And as you can see, it has a perforation to receive the Outram standard rail spike, which is right by there. It's hard to tell exactly where this sleeper came from originally, but it's tempting to say that it came from the Clydach line after it was converted into a plateway. Anyway, this perforation was generally filled with a wooden plug before the spike was hammered in, therefore ensuring a tight seal. At certain intervals along the rails, these sleepers were often accompanied by cast iron sills. On the right is an illustration of a rail sill. A sill basically comprised a rail tie with 2 chairs on either end into which the plate rail sat. So the rail tie is going along the middle and the chairs are here and the rail sat in them like in a chair. These chairs were again mounted into a corresponding pair of stone sleepers. Sills came in many different forms based on the type of joint between the rail and chair. This sill is of the dovetail variety, as it fits in place with a dovetail joint. You can't really see that here, but I have to take my word for it. It should also be mentioned that different types of plates existed on tramroads. On the left is a type of plate known as a Van Dyked plate. Like anything with the adjective Van Dyked attached to it, it's basically scalloped in form. This term comes from the paintings of Anthony van Dyck from the 17th century, which often included figures with these kinds of scalloped garments and other pieces of clothing. Van Dyck plates allowed ordinary vehicles such as horse-drawn carts, tumbrils, things like that, to cross the tramroad's rails horizontally while avoiding the slippage of their wheels vertically along the rails. The wheels of the carts fit into the grooves between the scallops, so you can imagine a cartwheel going along, or across like that, with the wheel fitting in between the scallops. This also increased the surface area of the plate's flange, making it a bit stronger and making it less likely to break into the cart's wheels. As I've mentioned before, plate rails broke frequently. Another type of plate was the check plate, which was double flanged here. These forced the tram's wheels in one direction, particularly in areas where they were liable to slip off the track. Also, these were useful at points where there's basically a fork in the track. A common problem at points was the tram following the wrong track. Double flanged rails were therefore useful in making sure this didn't happen. By the way, both of these images are from John Van Loan's PhD, which focused on early tramroads in South Wales. And here are 2 amazing photographs from the 19th century that show the forms of tramroads as they existed in the period. The photograph on the left is a tramroad associated with the Derby Canal in England. It illustrates really nicely how an Outram-style tramroad looked like, with its stone sleepers and cast iron plate rails. You can probably see that this particular tramroad had issues with dirt collecting on the rails, which is probably why the rails are suspended above the ground. The photograph on the right is much closer to home. This is Hall's Tramroad at Crumlin, which was opened in 1814 between Risca and about halfway up the Sirhawi Valley. The photograph was taken in 1857, at a time when tramroads such as these were actually getting a bit old hat, I suppose. The photograph was included in Michael Lewis's recent book entitled Steam on the Sirhawi Tramroad, which I thoroughly recommend. In terms of the kinds of vehicles that used tramroads, there were several different types, although almost all of which were horse-drawn. But as I said previously, some tramroads were used for locomotive experiments. So here are 2 such types. The first on the left was the most basic and numerous type, the tram. The oldest trams used during the late 18th and early 19th century were notably small, mostly built from timber, and had sloping sides. As these trams here were used on tramroads, they had unflanged wheels. although naturally trams that ran along railroads required flanged wheels. By the mid-19th century, a big variety of trams were employed, including larger trams, those constructed from cast iron, and those with springs for suspension. On the right is what was called a bogie or bogie wagon. These comprised open-top wagons and, initially at least, were specially designed to haul iron bars produced in rolling mills or pigs cast straight out of the blast furnace, both of which were long and unsuitable for hauling in standard trams. However, these were later used to carry large blocks of coal as well, extracted using the longwall method of mining, which was prevalent in South Wales by the mid to late 19th century. This is not to be confused with modern longwall mining, by the way, which is machine-based and quite different. Bogie wagons were likely invented in South Wales and emerged from the iron industry. Again, the photograph on the right comes from Michael Lewis's steamer on the Southern Powys Tramroad. As well as wheeled vehicles, it was common for farmers to walk their livestock along tram roads and railroads for transhumance purposes or to take them to market. This was often done at the expense of a toll payment to the proprietors of the tram or railroad. So now that we've seen a broad outline of the canals and the railed infrastructure that was associated with them, it's time to focus on the Bryn Oer Tramroad itself. Construction of the tramroad was commissioned in large part by Benjamin Hall, who served as proprietor of the Union Ironworks in Rumney from 1810, after inheriting the site from the Crochet family, who were most famous for being an ironmaster dynasty in Merthyr Tydfil. Hall married Richard Crochet's daughter, Charlotte, in 1801, and from 1803 he was a partner in the comparative ironworks. Hall was therefore a pretty important figure in the South Wales iron industry in the early 19th century. This Benjamin Hall is not to be confused with the son, also called Benjamin Hall, who was first Baron Llanover. It's said that Big Ben in London was named after him, the son. That's a bit of useless trivia for you there. Benjamin Hall, the father, proposed the construction of the Bryn Oer Tramroad along with George Overton and Jonathan Dixon, who I'll get into in the next slide. He was also one of the founders of the Bryn Oer Company, who served as proprietors of the Bryn Oer Tramroad. The Bryn Oer Tramroad was built in 1814 and was opened in 1815. In order to provide a bit of economic context, it's also worth briefly mentioning the economic conditions of the time that the Bryn Oer Tramroad was built. The economic system that dominated most of the post-medieval period, which is mercantilism, was by this time effectively dead and was replaced by a more modern form of capitalism, or at least a type advocated by thinkers such as Adam Smith, who was writing 30 or so years previously, and also David Ricardo, who was writing about this time in the early 19th century. As a result, the idea that the hoarding of national gold and silver reserves was somehow beneficial died away, and Britain as a whole was far more open to trading in cash. By the time the Bryn Oer Tramroad opened, the so-called continental system had also just come to an end, which was basically a naval blockade on Britain enforced by Napoleon, which pretty much halted trade between Britain and the rest of Europe. The Bryn Oer Tramroad was therefore opened during a time of larger investment than had previously been seen during the Napoleonic Wars. It must also be remembered that 1814 to 15 was a time when the Bubble Act 1720 had yet to be repealed. This act forbade the formation of joint stock companies without royal charter. Many at the time said that this act was passed to prevent another economic crash like the one caused by the share price collapse of the famous South Sea Company. In hindsight, this is debatable, and it's more likely that the act was passed so that the South Sea Company, which was responsible for buying government debt and speculating in the international slave trade, could hold monopoly over joint stock speculation in Britain. By the way, the work of Helen Paul from the University of Southampton particularly highlights this. If you're interested in this subject, it's definitely worth checking that out. The construction of the canals and tramroads in South Wales were financed as joint stock ventures, and they required acts of parliament to raise funds in this manner because of this. The Bubble Act was finally repealed in 1825. Incidentally, one of the first companies to be formed after the repeal was the British Iron Company, who established the British Ironworks at Abersychan in Torfaen. So to return to Bryn Oer, Benjamin Hall was producing plenty of pig iron at its Union Ironworks. However, the Rumney Valley was at this time quite an inauspicious location for industry, as it was mostly unconnected to an expansive haulage network, so the Rumney Valley down here. Because of this, the haulage of iron was costly for Hall, who at this time was relying on pack horses to transport his iron to the tram roads of the Sirhawi Valley, which is just across to the right here. To reduce his haulage expenses, Hall needed to establish his own tram road to the nearest canal, which is the B&A Canal in the north. That's the B&A Canal running along there. It will be remembered that an 8-mile clause was placed on the construction of canal tram roads via the Acts of Parliament that authorised their construction in the first place. This legal limitation was a bit of a problem for Hall, as although the B&A Canal had come Crown on passed within under 7 miles of his Union Ironworks, its position beyond the slopes of Mynydd Llangenedr and the lack of wharfage in that area meant that this route was unfeasible. The only feasible route to the B&A Canal led towards Talbot-on-Usk at the head of the Carvanich Valley, which used the Nant Trevel Valley as a natural corridor between the uplands. That's Talbot-on-Usk, upper Carvanich Valleys here, Nant Trevel Valleys down there. Unfortunately, this route was more than 11 miles in length. The Hall devised a way around this issue, and it was basically the same trick I talked about previously, to split the rail line into legally distinct tram roads. To call this a legal loophole would be a bit overstating it a bit, as it's quite a crude solution, I suppose. To the south of the Nant Trevel Valley, on the western foothills of Rumney Hill, was an area known as Bryn Oer, where Hall owned a collection of collieries, which are here. He'd been leasing these to George Overton and Jonathan Dixon, who incidentally were also interested in establishing a direct route to Talbot-on-Usk so they could transport their coal via canal. Therefore, it was decided by Hall, Overton and Dixon that the Bryn Oer Tramroad should be built, leading towards the Carvanich Valley from Trevel to the north of Bryn Oer. This routing length would be precisely 8 miles. Also, Hall could have access to this new route by establishing his own private tram road from Rumney to Trevel. This was him splitting the route up for legal reasons, although in practical terms, these effectively formed the same line as they shared the same gauge and were seamlessly connected. And here's his private tram road going down here. Interestingly, it seems that the lease agreement for the Bryn Oer collieries was signed specifically to encourage the construction of the Bryn Oer Tramroad, as the Bryn Oer Company, who served as the proprietors of the tramroad, was established 4 months prior to the signing of the lease. As well as Hall, Overton and Dixon, the shareholders of the Bryn Oer Company were made up of a range of local industrialists who would ultimately benefit from the new tramroad. As the proprietors of the B&A Canal had declined to construct the tramroad themselves, funds were collected from individual investors, with 130 shares being floated on the stock market for this purpose, each with a value of £100 or the equivalent of over £4,600 today. In total, the construction of the tramroad cost £12,800 or over £735,000 today. So to recap, the tramroad ran from the Quarryman's Arms in Trevel, down here, near the limestone quarry there, which is very famous, to the canal wharfs up at Talbot-on-Usk. As is indicated by this map, the Bryn Oer Tramroad crossed a varied landscape. From the Quarryman's Arms in Trevel, the tramroad extended northwards for about 3 kilometres up the Nant Trevel Valley, which is positioned between the hills of Cefn Ystrad and Mynydd Llangenedr to the west and east. From here, the tramroad snaked around the western and northern edges of the Dyffryn Crown Valley near the Nant River. The length of this meandering stretch was approximately 4 kilometres, and once the tramroad reached the southern edge of what is now Talbot Reservoir, its course extended towards the northeast for a further 3 kilometres. Beyond here, the tramroad ran along the northern foothills of Torr of Oil, before descending its northern slopes at the base of which Talbot-on-Usk is situated. This final stretch of tramroad extended for approximately 3 kilometres through the upper Carvanich Valley. It's important to mention that the Talbot Reservoir didn't exist when the Bryn Oer Tramroad was constructed. The reservoir was built in the 1930s. So here are some key views along the remains of the Bryn Oer Tramroad today. These photographs were taken during the walkover survey I conducted in 2022. These photos exemplify the varied landscape that the Bryn Oer Tramroad crosses. If you're ever in the area, I highly recommend walking this route. It takes a while, but the views are pretty spectacular. And here is a 19th century map of Talabont on Usk, which illustrates the position of some of the more important structures attached to the Bryn Oer Tramroad. As these structures were positioned towards the canal wharves, they were mainly associated with trade and finance. The map shows the position of the bank of lime kilns, as well as a weigh house where goods hauled towards the wharves were weighed. The map also shows the position of two wharves owned by George Overton and the Powell Company. By this time, the Brecon and Merthyr Railway had been constructed, which is also illustrated on the map here. Go this way, down there. This indicates that the map can be dated to the 1860s or afterwards. It's interesting to note that where the Bryn Oer Tramroad originally ran right up to the Canal Bridge here, at the centre of Talabont and Usk, the construction of the railway in this area meant that the tramroad had to be diverted slightly. It's also interesting that even with the Brecon and Merthyr Railway running through Talabont and Usk, the Bryn Oer Tramroad was still being used for haulage. This is probably due to the fact that the tramroad until the late 19th century represented the only viable haulage route from the Carvanich Valley towards Treville. The later railway line largely bypassed this area, as although it did run towards Talabont and Usk, it did so from a westerly rather than southerly direction. Here's another Michael Blackmore illustration. This one depicts the B&A Canal at Talabont and Usk. Here we can see the bank of lime kilns here, and above this you just make out the Bryn Oer Tramroad here. Also, we can see that the lime being collected from the kilns in barrels, which is then rolled down the bank onto the canal barges down here. So now we're going to focus on the field work that we conducted on the Bryn Oer Tramroad last year. Before going into this, it should be mentioned that our fieldwork was conducted at the back of two other recent fieldwork projects, including those by Richard Hankinson and Nigel Jones of CPAT, whose survey of the tramroad in effect formed the basis of our research, and also Andre Berry, who was commissioned by the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority to refine the previous CPAT survey. Our survey was basically conducted in order to refine this second survey and to formulate an interpretation of all the findings. This survey was also supported by the watching brief we conducted, which recorded the structure of several other culverts along the tramroad and their stratigraphic relationship to the tramroad itself. When walking along the tramroad today, it's evident that the original iron rails had pretty much been salvaged after the abandonment of the tramroad in the late 19th century. Also, the vast majority of the sleepers are missing, many of which may have been salvaged again or at least significantly displaced. Of those surviving sleepers, we can observe on the one hand that they held cast iron sills in place, and on the other, that the majority of these sleepers lacked perforations to receive rail spikes. Instead, sills were merely pressed into the top of the sleepers without being fastened in place. The imprint of the sill seen in this photograph was a result of gradual wear and friction between sill and sleeper. Where sleepers with rail spikes do occur, they're mostly situated at bends in the line. In this sense, although the tramroad was built fundamentally as an Outram standard rail line, it nevertheless incorporated deviations from Outram's designs. I suppose this makes sense, as the tramroad was, after all, designed and built by Overton nearly a decade after the death of Outram in 1805. And it seems that, in some respects, Overton had imbued the structure of the tramroad with his own ideas. Gordon Rattenbury and John Van Loan, writing in the 1960s and 90s respectively, indicate the presence on the tramroad of Van Dyke plates. Rattenbury was quite puzzled by the Van Dyke plate, as it seems he hadn't seen one before. These would have been used to allow carts to cross the tramroad at certain intervals, most likely at turnouts, where the necessary stoppages could take place. And turnouts will be discussed a bit later. Also, the gauge width of the Bryn Oer Tramroad was a uniform 3 foot 6 inches. This gauge was perfectly in line with Outram's recommendations. The 3 foot 6 inch gauge was recommended by him for all mineral tramroads that sustained light to moderate traffic, like the Bryn Oer Tramroad. During the construction and maintenance of the tramroad, hydrological factors were considered very seriously. The Bryn Oer Tramroad basically was formed by creating an elongated shelf cut along the valleys and hill slopes, which comprise flat surfaces susceptible to the collecting of standing water. And as a result, the tramroad had to be regularly drained. Drainage issues were also heightened by the predominantly hilly terrain that the tramroad crossed, as the steep hill slopes allowed continual streams of water to pour down onto the tramroad. To combat this, culverts were constructed along the tramroad. During the watch and brief and walkover survey, a total of 53 culverts were recorded. In form, these comprised an inflow head towards the top of the shelf cut and an outfall head towards the base of the shelf cut. Water would enter the inflow head via a drainage channel cut along or parallel with the tramroad, and would then leave via the outfall head, which was attached to a long drainage channel running downslope perpendicular to the tramroad. During the watch and brief, it was noticed that two basic types of culvert existed: the box type on the right and the arch type on the left. The box type was basically box shaped in profile and made up of flat slabs, and the arch type incorporated an arched roof with voussoirs made from smaller slabs. And here's a map of all known culverts along the Bryn Oer Tramroad. The map may appear a bit confused, as there were quite a lot of culverts, with many of them concentrated in fairly small areas. But hopefully the map gives some indication as to their distribution. So in total, 39 culverts were of the box variety, 5 were of the arch variety, and the remaining 9 couldn't be identified because their inflow and or outfall heads were covered in colluvial silt. The box type culverts were fairly evenly distributed along the tramroad, while the arch type culverts were concentrated in particularly hilly areas where higher quantities of floodwater were expected. I guess this makes sense, as the arch culverts appeared to allow more water to pass through them and were therefore better at dealing with consistent flooding episodes. Another type of feature that was recorded along the tramroad was the turnout. Turnouts comprised short sidings that allowed one tram or train of trams to pass another. Turnouts were essential, as trams traveling both ways along the tramroad did so on the same set of rails. The loaded trams possessed right-of-way over empty trams. This rule was set up to prevent potential delays in the delivery of freight caused by congestion. Whenever an encounter occurred on the tramroad, it was the responsibility of those accompanying the empty trams to pull into the turnouts, therefore allowing the loaded trams to pass via the main line. Alternatively, if an encounter occurred beyond the nearest turnout, then the empty tram would be reversed into that turnout. In terms of form, turnouts were recognised during the walkover survey. Sections of tramroad that had been deliberately widened. So you just about see the widening here, and that's sort of extended beyond the photograph. Examination of the known turnouts along the tramroad indicate that most were formed with explosives, or black powder as it was known in the 19th century. As a result, turnouts were often supported by retaining walls, which held back the exposed section of rock caused by blasting. And here's one such retaining wall going along here. In total, 12 turnouts were recorded along the tramroad. And here is a map showing, among other things, all known turnouts along the Bryn Oer Tramroad. Mostly where they do appear, their distribution is fairly even. However, there are 2 points of interest here. Firstly, no turnouts have been recorded south of the Dyffryn Crown Valley, meaning that a fairly large stretch of tramroad appears free of turnouts. So that's the area I'm referring to down here. No turnouts here. It is of course possible, though, that turnouts were simply missed during the survey in this area, as they failed to survive as visual features in the landscape. Secondly, Two of the turnouts were situated very close to one another, around 90 meters apart, and these are the two I'm referring to here. It could be that these weren't in contemporary use and that one was constructed to replace the other, but it also seems that these turnouts were associated with a pair of gateways to the south, and these are the gateways I'm referring to here in red. When considering the canal tram roads in the region, gateways are a rarity. Only these two were discovered along the Bryn Oer Tramroad. While their presence was previously recorded by Hankinson and Sylvester of CPAT, their intended function has been a bit of a mystery. So here's a photograph of one of the gateways, or at least what remains of it. In form, these gateways survive as singular lines of thin sandstone slabs running across the tramroad surface in perpendicular fashion. The separation between the two gateways is around 630 meters, and they're situated only around 1.4 kilometers south of Talabont on Usk. So when traveling northward along the tramroad towards the canal, these gateways would have been encountered on approach to Talabont on Usk. Initially, I thought they might have been associated with toll collection, but the toll collection point on the Bryn Oer Tramroad was the Weybridge Cottage in Talabont on Usk, situated immediately south of the canal wharfs. Instead, I think these gateways were associated with a pair of farms situated along the western edge of the tramroad, which are shown on the 1839 tithe map of the area. And here is an illustration based on that 1839 tithe map. We have two gateways in red. We also have a pair of farms in black, and then we have a trackway leading up to the tram roads from the two farms, which is this brown linear thing here. The two farms are referred to on the tithe map as Upper Danawenach Farm and Felin Newydd Farm. In the apportionment attached to the tithe map, George Overton is listed as the owner of Upper Danawenach Farm, as well as all the fields between here and the tram road, which he likely purchased for the purpose of constructing the trackway. In this sense, it seems possible that the two gateways were erected so that livestock could join the tram road from the farms. In other words, when closed, the two gateways allowed a section of tramway to be closed off so that the livestock could join in single file without the risk of getting hit by trams. So to provide a bit of further historical context to the Bryn Oer Tramroad, it's important to acknowledge that the tramroad and others like it, whether it belonged to the canal system or not, was constructed in an industrial environment in South Wales that was already defined heavily by innovation in rail transport. Many people would say look to England, particularly Northern England, for the earliest developments in rail transport, but South Wales is just as important and possesses its own quite unique history. So, for example, during the 17th century, a large system of timber wagonways was constructed by Humphrey Mackworth for the purposes of connecting his collieries in Neath to the Melling Crwthan copper works via a canalised waterway. Again, we're always taught that the first canals came about in northwest England in the mid-18th century, such as the Sankey Canal. But here we can see precursors or even prototypes to such transport networks in South Wales. By the 1750s, Chauncey Townsend had established a similar yet far larger network of wagonways and canalised waterways in Swansea and Llanelli. Both the Mackworth and Townsend wagonways and canals are detailed in Stephen Hughes's Copperopolis book, published by the Royal Commission. Also, in 1776, it's likely that the colliery owner John Morris laid the first all-iron rails in Wales, which he ordered from Coalbrookdale in Shropshire. These were laid in an underground tunnel in 1788. This was only a year after John Kerr invented the plateway. In terms of the Bryn Oer Tramroad's importance when compared to other contemporary transport routes, some other points should be mentioned. Firstly, the 3-foot 6-inch gauge of the Bryn Oer Tramroad was a common feature of most tramroads attached to the Monmouthshire and B&A Canal. There were some outliers though. Some of the earliest tramroads were slightly narrower, such as the Blaenavon Tramroad, which had a gauge width of 3 foot 4 inches. This ran up to the Blaenavon Ironworks. Secondly, the unperforated sleepers that the tramroad incorporated were relatively uncommon within the wider canal network. Yet parallels can be drawn with the later Hereford Tramroad of 1829, which also incorporated plate rails that merely rested on stone sleepers. Thirdly, the tramroad incorporated a comparatively large number of turnouts, indicating that it was expected by the Bryn Oer Company that the tramroad would witness significant amounts of traffic. This can be contrasted with another tramroad in South Wales that had sustained comparative degrees of survey work, which is the Brecon Forest Tramroad, surveyed by Stephen Hughes in the 1990s. The Brecon Forest Tramroad was constructed in 1821 to 25 between Onhywyn and Senny Bridge, and was later extended in 1832 to 34 towards the Swansea Canal at Gurnos. It's about 12 miles long. The Brecon Forest Tramroad was significantly longer than the Bryn Oer Tramroad and was also more complex both in terms of form and civil engineering. However, despite its larger size, the Brecon Forest Tramroad incorporated significantly less turnouts than the Bryn Oer Tramroad, indicating that it was expected to sustain much less traffic. The Brecon Forest Tramroad, I think there's like only two or three turnouts. So yes, that's significantly less than the Bryn Oer Tramroad, despite its larger size. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, Jack.